Hello, I am Jose Garcia Moreno, and I'll be your host for this episode. The overall purpose of this podcast, Advocate, is to capture people and their complex and rich identities and show you who they are through their own stories. We only have one guest for this particular installment of Advocate, and he is Dr. Amir Hussain. Thank you, Amir, for being with us. We interviewed him roughly 1 year ago and follow up with him right now in June of 2024, because as of today, he will have shared this expertise at two very different points in time. And we believe his expertise is vital in divisive, violent, and newsworthy times. So we will let you hear the salient points of our first interview with our esteemed guest and segue into our most recent conversation for further reflection. Amir, please, could you please share with us your affiliation with LMU?
Thank you for letting me be here. I am a professor of theological studies here at LMU in the Bellman College of Liberal Arts, and I've been here now for 19 years.
Just to start the conversation, you're actually Canadian, and you had a great success studying and teaching in Canada. What actually brought you to the U.S. and specifically to LMU?
Like a lot of PhD candidates, you're excited about where you might end up. And I got the job offer to come to Los Angeles. So that was in 1997. And my first 8 years in LA weren't here at LMU. They were at Cal State Northridge. It's funny what you remember from, 20 years ago, that the value of the Cal State system, and I quote, as creating educated workers for the California workforce. Nothing wrong with creating workers. Obviously, you want to give students, vocational training and skills where they can go out and get a job. Absolutely. And so I thought, maybe I should look for another place to work. Is there a place that actually tries to create educated citizens for the world? I didn't know the first thing about the Jesuits, but I knew about LMU. I had a colleague who taught here, and so I reached out to him. They had a job in 2005, and so it worked out nicely. Here I am looking for a job. Here they are looking for a scholar of Islam, and it came together. But if you'd asked me in Toronto in 1997, do you see yourself teaching at a Jesuit university in Los Angeles? I would have said, why would I move to Los Angeles? Toronto's a great city. Jesuit University, I'm not even sure who the Jesuits are. Like Catholic University, why would I go to a Catholic? I'm not even a Christian. It's only Catholics who go to Catholic universities, right? Then you realize, well, no, it's a much bigger world. And so I can't, I've been here since 2005. I can't imagine a better place to be than being at the Jesuit University in Los Angeles.
Do you find a different reaction from society towards the Muslim community in Canada and another in the United States, specifically here in California?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is that difference. Now, part of that has to do with history, geography. What I mean by that is Canada, roughly speaking, has about 30 million people. Roughly speaking, there's about 1.2 million Muslims. So you have a lot of Muslims relative to the population, a lot of Muslims who are integrated in ways that you just don't see here. What I mean by that is that, for example, like the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the state media, the woman who does the national news at 6 o'clock is a hijabi. She's a Muslim woman who wears the hijab. I don't know that you would see that in America of, the 6 o'clock news on CBS, NBC, done by a woman in hijab. And so I think you have that kind of integration there. Part of that, the negative perceptions of Muslims here aren't unique to 9/11. Post 9/11, you saw a lot of rise in Islamophobic kinds of things. But pre 9/11, 79 with the revolution in Iran, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, going back to like the gas crisis in OPEC in the 70s, I think the sort of political ways in which Islam has been lived out in the world affect people in America and in Canada in very different, kinds of ways. And so I think, the Muslim community, I think, is more integrated. Doesn't mean there aren't issues. So, for example, in the province of Quebec, you have this bill, C-21, that was passed that basically makes it a crime to be religiously observant in certain kinds of ways, which means like if you're a Jewish person wearing the kippah, or if you're a Sikh wearing the turban, or if you're a Muslim woman wearing the hijab in certain public settings. And you want to say, wait, doesn't Canada have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that guarantees religious freedom? How can this province sort of, do this, which really, and the research on that, I'm actually speaking at a conference in October at McGill University around this. The research is that, this really is targeting Muslims. It's really designed as an anti-Muslim, kind of thing. So what I'm saying here is that it's not that there aren't issues in Canada for Muslims. It's a different sort, here in America. Part of that has to do with the history. There's a history in this country of Muslims that goes back centuries, back to the transatlantic slave trade. We don't think about that 10% of the slaves that were brought over from West Africa were Muslim. And so there's a history here that you don't have in Canada.
What would you say for the general public are like the biggest, the most common misconceptions about Muslims?
So it's a lot of things. For the general population, you may not know a Muslim. If you look at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, they do really good data. The last sort of polling they did, 60% of Americans, when asked, will say they don't know a Muslim. That said, when asked, 60% of them will say Islam is very different than their own religion. I'm like, wait, how are those two things possible? How can the majority say, I don't know someone who's a Muslim, and then start making claims about the tradition? That has to do with the media. And so I think the issue is, in the media, you may have negative representations of Muslims. If the only Muslim you see is the terrorist, if the only Muslim you see is the violent extremist, if the only Muslim you see is the person, calling for women not to be educated in Afghanistan, or women not to be have to wear the veil in Iran, you can see the problems with that. What's been interesting over the last couple of years is seeing the changes precisely because of the change in media. What I mean by that is, I never would have guessed in 2000, I never would have said in 2005 when I came here, you know what, there's going to be a couple of Muslims who are big-time stars in television. Rami Youssef is going to have his own show on Hulu because, in 2005, Hulu, there was no such thing as streaming media. That Ms. Marvel is going to be a Muslim, that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is going to have, because, who knew the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is going to have a Muslim teenager who's from Bangladesh, who's, a lead character there. And so I think that changes things. So the misconceptions, back to your original question, are that somehow Islam is a violent religion, that Muslims somehow are violent people, as if, Christians or Hindus or Buddhists haven't committed violence, that Islam is somehow this misogynist tradition, that Muslim women don't have the same, status as Muslim men do. And so I think you hear those kinds of things. Around gender, on sexuality, that, Muslims don't approve of same-sex marriage, Muslims don't approve of, gender, the fluidity of gender. And that's been this fascinating thing. I've just to go on that. I have a student who's writing a paper for me in a comparative theology class looking at gender and gender identity, and the fact that for all the issues with Iran, with all the sort of repressiveness, the conservatism of the Iranian regime, they do gender reassignment surgery. They understand that, if you think that, I'm biologically in a male body, but I'm really a female, that this is really my identity, we can do the surgery to do that. And this Muslim country will, do that. So it really becomes, as you start looking at it, a little more complicated than those simple things of Muslims are violent, Muslims are homophobic, Muslims are, misogynist.
Of course, you are, a very successful writer and researcher, academician. And you have Oil and Water and Muslims and the Making of America. What would you recommend would be to someone just to get in touch with, to discover Islam? What do you recommend?
I think there's different books you can read, but there's films you can watch, there's music you can listen to. That helps you understand the Islamic world in all its complexity. One Night in Miami, which tells the story of the night that Muhammad Ali wins the heavyweight championship of the world after the defeat of Sonny Liston. And he celebrates that night with his friends, Malcolm X, Jim Brown, the football player, and Sam Cooke, the singer. That actually happened. That we don't know what happened at that meeting because there was no records of that. But the film, which is a fictional version of that story, is amazing. And I showed this in class, and they have these great scenes between the actor playing Malcolm X and the actor playing Muhammad Ali. I'm like, how many times do you see two black men on television or on the screen, both of whom are Muslims, talking about their Islam? Some of it may be for those of us who like to read. really interesting books about Islam. So Reza Aslan, who's this wonderful writer, his book, No God But God, talks about Islam. Karen Armstrong, who used to be a nun, has a marvelous book about Islam, a marvelous book about the Prophet Muhammad. There's so many negative images of the Prophet, and non-Muslims don't have a sense of that. So Karen's work, I think, is really marvelous. But for some folks, it's the music. You want to learn about Islam? Listen to Mos Def's Black on Both Sides. That record is really interesting. He's a hip-hop artist, but he begins the record with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, the opening phrases of the Quran.
I have always wondered, because when I was in Marrakesh, there is like this, the presence of the day being time in terms of praying, and the daily routine, and how important praying is for Muslims. Tell me a little bit about, like, how do you find, which I find it fascinating. I'm really fascinated with the way that Muslims pray, and how, if you can create an analogy or create like a reference in terms of what you see of Catholicism and the way that Catholics pray.
That's a great question. And now part of that is tempered by, remember, I grew up in Canada at a time when Islam wasn't sort of, dominant. So when my family moved to Toronto in 1970, there was one mosque in the city. We didn't live close to it. My parents worked, and so we couldn't, go. We went for like the big holidays. When I left Toronto in 1997, there was like 35 mosques, and you have that kind of presence here. So the prayer in Islam is seen as the most important thing for humans. Like, the Quran says that prayer is the human activity that God prefers over any other human activity, that the proper function of human beings is to pray, to praise their creator. And as you so very eloquently said, in a traditional Muslim society, the day is really around the prayer time. You pray the first prayer at dawn, before you get up. The next prayer at noon, and then not 12 o'clock, but when the sun is sort of halfway in its journey. The next prayer, the third prayer in the afternoon, between, when the sun is at the highest point and then when it's about to set. The fourth prayer at sunset. The fifth prayer at night, between night and the next day's dawn. And so, you have that cycle of prayer. Now, if you're traditional Catholic, you have that same cycle. Most of us don't pray the hours, unless you're a monk, now. But that sense of, making space each point in the day for prayer. Having that prayer as an embodied prayer, so people can't see this, but we're doing this podcast in my office, but, folded up is my prayer rug. And so, when it's time for the prayer and you're able to sort of unfold the prayer rug and do your prayers. And the prayer is very much an embodied prayer. You stand, you bow, you literally kneel and touch your head to the ground. Now, Christians were doing that long before Muslims were invented. My favorite, again, you can't see this because, this is a podcast, but in the office, there's a book, the Lindisfarne Gospels. They're my favorite illustrated Gospels made by monks, in Ireland, Irish monks who are actually off the coast of Scotland. And the pages in between are called carpet pages because they look for all the world like oriental carpets, like prayer mats. And you think, well, why are these Christian monks putting these oriental carpets in their gospel text? Well, because what did Christian prayer look like in the 9th century? You stood, you bowed, you knelt. Churches, Catholic churches, when they were first built, didn't have pews. Catholics, you stood, you knelt, you stood, you bowed, you knelt. So that physical form of the prayer, I think for many Catholics is sort of interesting when they see Muslims do these prayer motions that they used to do, which some still do. It's been fascinating looking at, as an outsider, at the Mass, let's say, at Sacred Heart, and how many people, pull down the misericord and kneel on it, how many people stand for communion, how many people, sit at communion, how many people kneel down, just those kinds of things. So I think that practice of standing, bowing, kneeling, like literally in your body, showing your surrender to God, because Islam literally means surrender to God, a Muslim, one who surrenders. Well, what is Christian life but surrender to God? What is Christian prayer but that sense of literally bowing and kneeling, not just sort of sitting, in a chair with your hands folded across your chest and contemplating with your head, but literally with your body doing certain actions.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Tell us a little bit about, can you explain the audience a little bit about the AAR that you're part of the board of directors, and what is you serve as a president. What is the reach and impact?
That's fascinating. Thank you for asking that. So most of us in academia have our own sort of professional society. So you have the American Historical Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Academy of Religion is the largest collection of scholars of religion in the world. We have about 8,000 members who study religion in all its forms. Someone like me does Islam, someone that does, traditional Catholicism, someone that does, gay men's issues in religion, whatever. We have an annual meeting every year that meets in conjunction with the Society of Biblical Literature. That's about 10,000 scholars of religion coming together. I've been fortunate to have leadership roles in that academy. So in 2010, I edited the journal. We publish a journal that goes out 4 times a year, the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. It's sort of one of the top scholarly journals. And it was really great. We were the first Catholic university to publish that journal, and we were able to have our students involved in that, to help them with the editing process, the writing process. And that was, and again, you can't see the smile on my face, but perhaps you can hear it, is a nice kind of thing to think, oh yeah, the first Catholic university to host this prestigious scholarly journal. It's not Georgetown, it's not Notre Dame, it's little old LMU. And part of it for me is recognizing that as a Muslim scholar, I'm I think the 4th scholar of Islam to be the president of the American Academy of Religion and the first Muslim to do that.
Beautiful. I'm just having these memories about this project that ACTI created a couple of months ago, in which you were a part of it. That for ACTI is very important to create this dialogue with the other religions, and in that occasion we actually talk about the relation between the arts and sacred texts, and you gave this, magnificent presentation. Can you just summarize a little bit what you said?
I talked about, if you were a scribe who was illuminating the gospel text in the 10th century, you had much more in common with a Jewish scribe who was writing the Torah or a Muslim scribe who was writing the Quran than you did with other Catholics, because this was your guild. This was the work that you did. And you exchanged ideas, you exchanged things. And I told the story where I was really privileged to go to the university, St. John's, that did the St. John's Bible, and actually meet with Don Jackson, who was the head calligrapher. And then we had a discussion. He gave a talk at the Getty. And I asked him point blank to say, okay, when you did the Matthew genealogy page in the St. John's Gospel, you created the flames, because basically what he does, and for those that know the New Testament, Matthew begins with the genealogy of Jesus, what's the lineage of Jesus. And what Don Jackson did in the calligraphy of that was do a menorah, and have the menorah with the genealogy sort of running down the candle arms. But the flames are done in the way that Muslims would do the flames. And there's a couple of names in Arabic. And I asked him point blank, was this conscious on your part? He said, absolutely. This was a conscious nod to the fact that, the medieval world, the religious world, was this interconnected world where Jesus is Jewish. He's not Catholic. The medieval world is one in which Muslims play a role. If you look at the great philosopher in the Catholic tradition, the great theologian, Thomas Aquinas, can you understand Aquinas without knowing the interlocutors he had? Maimonides, in the Jewish tradition, Averroes, Ibn Rushd in the Islamic tradition, that there's this synergy here, there's this work here. And so for me, it was just amazing to have that sense of, okay, here on this illuminated biblical manuscript, the calligrapher has very consciously brought in Jewish and Muslim elements into this to show that shared heritage, because we tend to think of these things as silos, but we know that those traditions impacted each other. Those traditions affected each other. The kind of work that I do on Muslim-Catholic dialogue, we can say, well, that's new because of Nostra Aetate in October of 1965, the Church's teachings on other religious traditions. But you can say, yeah, you go back to St. Francis, and the fact that St. Francis, before he was St. Francis, when he was just Francis, he goes to the Muslim world in 1219, goes to Damietta in Egypt, dialogues with the Muslim Sultan. The Franciscan order is based in this understanding that when you live among Muslims, not if you live among Muslims, not on the occasion you live, but when you live among Muslims, here's how you are to do your work. And so the fact that literally the rule of the Franciscans is developed because the founder is in this dialogue with Muslims. So you can say, yeah, on the one hand, this Muslim-Catholic dialogue is 55 years old, going back to 1965, but it's really hundreds of years old, going back to the beginnings of Islam and the interactions. Can you understand St. Francis properly without looking at the connections? Can you understand Thomas Aquinas properly without looking at the Jewish and Muslim kinds of roots to Aquinas' thought?
If you actually come to Professor Hussain's office here at LMU in University Hall, and his door is full of postcards and images, and you told me that if you see the images in your door, you will know who you are. What kind of images do you have?
So, for me, I can tell a lot about a person from, back in the day when you guys had records, there's record collection and their art. Like, what's the art you have on your wall? Who are the records? What music do you listen to? And so if you look at my door, you'll see the kind of, there's a lot of musicians here. It's a lot, my generation. So, of course, my great heroes, the Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney. But then as someone who loves the guitar, like Stevie Ray Vaughan, who's this phenomenal guitar player. But then you'll see, that there's some things about William Blake, the English artist. I came to theology through the study of English literature, studying, because Blake and Shakespeare didn't make any sense unless you knew the Bible. I didn't know the Bible, so maybe I should learn about the Bible, and I should learn about my own religion. So you'll see art there. You'll see music there, some of my favorite actors. There's images of Paul Newman there. There's an image there of Patti Smith, who's, I always wanted to be Patti Smith when I grew up, like this amazing sort of performer, poet, one of the innovators in like punk rock, that kind of thing. And so I think it's great for the students to get a sense of, here are some of my heroes there.
Oh. Well, thank you so much again, Amir. This is Acti Advocate, and I'm Jose Garcia Moreno. Thank you for listening.
Don't go anywhere. As promised, part 2 of this Advocate episode featuring Dr. Amir Hussain and Acti Director Jose Garcia Moreno will start now.
Amir, you gave us this beautiful window into the differences between being Muslim in Canada and the United States in our previous interview. And you believe there is a difference between being an American and being a Angelino. We are in the new era of U.S. protests, many on college campuses, as you know, as we all our audience know. So what would you say within the framework of what we are experiencing now? What are the misperceptions of Jews and Muslims over the past year you want to highlight?
Thank you for that question. I think there's a couple of things. First is, and you talked about the campus protests, there's a misperception, first of all, that these are exclusively Muslim protests. And you want to say, well, no. In a lot of these protests, especially the one, let's say at UCLA, a lot of the folks in that protest, in the encampments, are Jews. And so you have Jews and Muslims who are involved in this, who both want peace and safety for Jews and Muslims, but also for Christians. And that's another thing to say here, that, here in North America, we tend to think of the Palestinians as exclusively Muslim and forget the Christian component of the Palestinians, 15% of whom are Christian, who've been Christian since the time of Jesus. And so, in the destruction of Gaza, so many, horrible things happen, so many things get destroyed. One of them is St. Porphyry's, which is perhaps the 4th oldest church in the world. And so for a lot of our students, there's Christians in Palestine, and they've been Christian since before Rome was Christian, and the 4th oldest church in the world is in Gaza and has been destroyed. So I think that, and then the last thing I'll say here is that we think of these movements, the student movements particularly, as somehow new, and they're not. We just lost a week or so ago Bill Walton, the great basketball player for both UCLA and professionally, countercultural guy, very famously in the 1970s playing for Coach Wooden at UCLA. He was very straight-laced. Coach Wooden had a no facial hair policy. Bill Walton was a California boy, a deadhead, follower of the Grateful Dead. 2 weeks off of practice, grew a beard, and showed up to practice. And Coach Wooden basically said, "Hey, Bill, aren't you forgetting something?" He said, "Well, you're talking about the beard." He goes, "Yes." And he goes, "Well, it's my right. I have a beard. I want to grow a beard. I have the right to have a beard." And Coach Wooden was like, "Oh, okay. This is something you very strongly believe in." "Yes, Coach, I do." "Wonderful. We're going to miss you on the team." This idea that you don't have a right to be on the team. You have a right to grow a beard. But the reason I mention this is, here's Bill growing a beard. Here's Bill in 1972, burning his draft card. And so the Vietnam War protests that happened on campuses, before that, the ethnic studies kinds of protests. Before I came to LMU, I taught for 8 years at Cal State Northridge. And CSUN was really, I think, the ground zero for Chicano studies. How did that start? Well, you had people who literally went into the dean's office, the president's office, sat down and said, "We're not going to leave here until you start changing the curriculum, until you start teaching our identity, until you start teaching our history as part of American history. It's not just the contributions of white people. It's the contributions of Latinos. It's the contribution of African Americans, all that kind of thing." And so I think that moment that we're seeing now are our students doing exactly what students have been doing for decades at American universities, sort of protesting the circumstances in which they find themselves.
Right. Yes. No, absolutely. And now that you're mentioning the student protests, because LMU, for people that actually are not familiar with the events that, at LMU, there was also a protest, probably smaller in scope, but still relevant. So just like tapping into that subject of the protest and of course there is, probably this is more rhetorical, but in your opinion, is there any validity to the notion that students can peacefully demonstrate on university campuses while somebody protests, disrupts business activity, which I think is like a mainstream narrative that has been associated with the demonstrations, just like to probably create like an enemy of democracy and peaceful demonstrations. So what will be your thought on that? And also, where do you, how can you frame what happened here at LMU in regards to the other ones? If there's like something specific that you would like to mention about what happened here.
So let me start by saying what's happening here. I think LMU is doing a really good job at what's happening both on the side of the students and faculty and staff who are protesting and on the side of the administration. So that's one of the things that you don't see. At other places, USC, UCLA, USC in particular, they had no contact whatsoever with the students, they being the administration. Very different here. You got the administration, whether you're talking about, President Snyder's office, whether you're talking about Provost Poon's office, having that conversation, not just with students, but with faculty, with staff. So that's a really important difference, which I think is part of the reason why you haven't seen, for example, things like the encampment, because oftentimes those are done by people who say, look, the administration is not listening to us. They're not even paying attention to us. So we will do something. And this goes to your point about disruption. At a certain level, protests have to be disruptive. If you're just standing quietly in your office holding up a sign, no one sees this, no one cares, no one walks by. Why do you have picket lines? Why do you have picket lines across driveways? Well, to prevent people from crossing them, to do those kinds of things, to make you realize, oh, there's something going on here. And so I think certainly there's an amount of disruption. Now, that always has to be peaceful and nonviolent. You can't be threatening other people. You can't be harassing other people. You can't be in any way physically violent towards other people. There's never an excuse for that. But I think having that kind of demonstration. So, for example, we have on this campus, an Office of Muslim Student Life. We have an Office of Jewish Student Life. We have student groups, Students Supporting Israel. We have Students for Justice in Palestine. And so how do you represent? Those are just 4 different groups, that we have: Muslim students, Students for Justice in Palestine, Students Supporting Israel, Jewish Student Life. How do they get to say what they want to say? And so we've had protests, for example, in University Hall, the building that I teach in, where the president's office is, where the provost's office is. And, people are disruptive. People are saying things, chanting things, doing things. Now, if they were doing it all day and we couldn't teach our classes, again, that's a different thing. I think the administration struck a great balance saying, okay, you can do this. You can protest. You can stand in front of the president's office and shout your demands about divestment, whatever it is that you want. And the president will hear that. But after a certain time period, it becomes, okay, now we need to get on with the business of things, and other students have just as much of a right to, go with their classes and do those things. The way that it's being framed, and I really appreciate the way you said it, is that it's been framed as almost an either or, that, these students can't do the things because these students over here are taking over and doing that work. And that's not true here. Like you have had students who've made disruptions. So at our graduation, for example, you had students just before President Snyder was about to speak saying some boycott, divest, sanctions. And to his credit, President Snyder let that happen for about, a minute or so. And then it became, okay, now let's focus on the topic at hand. By the way, we have things set up. We have free speech zones. So if you want to stand here and protest, that's great. And I love the fact that at the undergraduate graduation, John Legend literally said, let's talk about the elephant in the garden. Here he is in second garden. So let's talk about this. So the fact that the commencement speaker literally addressed it and did it the only way that John Legend could do it, which is singing a Stevie Wonder song. You're just marvelous. So I think I'm not trying to pat myself or pat ourselves on the back here, but I think we've done a really good job here of exactly balancing those things. How do students have the right as students, as citizens, as Americans to peacefully and publicly protest and demonstrate at the same time without damaging other students, without being violent towards other students, without letting other students, go on and do the kinds of work that they need to do.
Right. Yeah. No, it was that speech for anyone in the audience that's listening to us now, you should hear that speech from John Legend. It was beautiful. I mean, tapping a little bit into this subject, you in the previous interview, you talked about Dr. King being called a communist in 1967 and believed Malcolm X and Reza Aslan and Karen Armstrong and Mos Def as accessibly entry points to Islam. So which Muslim voice do you wish more people would listen to, since new tragedies and conflicts are pitting Muslims against Jewish and against almost everyone?
So I think part of it, again, is that history. It's funny because I was just speaking at a church in Laverne, the Church of the Brethren. The Church of the Brethren is one of those, pacifist churches like the Quakers, like the Mennonites, the Amish. They're probably the least well known, I think, because they don't have that kind of publicity the way that, when you think of peace, you think of Quakers, you think of the Mennonites, you don't think of Church of the Brethren. But I was talking about Muhammad Ali, exactly that same thing, that, when Muhammad Ali in 1967 refuses induction into the army, that's seen as un-American, that's seen as communist, because 64 is when he does the unthinkable, not just, beat Sonny Liston, but changes his name from Cassius Clay to Cassius X, then becomes reading Muhammad Ali, is no longer a Christian, he's now a Muslim. And then he's saying, this war is wrong, I don't want to do this. Now, 1972, Bill Walton, what we started with, perfectly fine to burn your draft card in 1972. 1967, this is a terrible thing. And so, the Ken Burns documentary about Muhammad Ali was so powerful because the first episode really was about Ali as a social justice warrior. So that's one example historically. But from that history, I talked about UCLA and my love for UCLA basketball and Coach Wooden. Well, his greatest player wasn't Bill Walton. It was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Kareem is still very much with us. Kareem has talked about, being a writer who happened to play basketball, that he was one of the greatest basketball players who ever lived. And he sort of sees that as like his side hustle back in the day. Now he's a writer. Now, Kareem in 67 was with Muhammad Ali at the famous Cleveland Summit. I was doing a lot of things when I was a freshman in college. Being, at a nationwide event like that was not one of them. So the fact that Kareem was doing this in 1967, he's doing this in 2024. And we had him as a commencement speaker in 2019. He was just marvelous. And so that voice, do we think of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's voice as a Muslim voice on these kinds of issues? Or do we look at a voice like Keith Ellison? I talked about 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, the sort of racial reckoning. Well, in 2021, the police officer that murders George Floyd is actually successfully prosecuted. And it's done by a Muslim attorney general, because the attorney general in Minnesota, where this happened, was Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison was the first Muslim elected to Congress in 2006. When he retired from Congress in 2018, went back home to Minnesota, got elected as Attorney General. And so he literally was the Attorney General who prosecuted that case in 2021. And so do we think about that? Do we think that, hey, it was actually a Muslim American who prosecuted that case? Now, did he do it because he was a Muslim? Of course not. He did it because he was a great prosecutor and a great legal person. But that's another example. Are we listening to someone like Keith Ellison? Are we listening to voices like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was there? And I use Kareem as an example because he was there in the 70s when all these things happened. We like to think that the things we're doing now are brand new and they never happened before. It's like, there's a history of racism in this country. There was a history of violence. There was a history of protests to this. And the fact that you have people who were there in the 1960s, in the 1970s, who thankfully are still very much with us now, are there. So those are the kinds of voices. But then there's so many voices in the popular culture. Again, we don't think of them as Muslim. Like, one of the most successful people on social media is a Los Angeles model, Gigi Hadid. Gigi's a Muslim. She's Palestinian. I think she has something like 78 million followers or something, on Instagram. And we don't think about that. Wait, a Muslim woman in America has 78 million followers on Instagram?
My next question, and it feels that I'm putting you in the spotlight of a very difficult question, but how the narrative in this country has placed the Islam as a faith of hate and violence and jihad. How can we help people understand that Islam is a religion of love?
And that's, again, the connection with Catholics. We talked about this before. 200 years ago, exactly the same kinds of ideas. Could Catholics be trusted to be good Americans in sort of Protestant America? I talked about the election of Barack Obama. Remember the election of John Kennedy in 1960. Could a Catholic be trusted to be president? Or would the Pope, John the 23rd, then be the real power player? And people had those images. If you vote for John Kennedy, you're not voting for Kennedy and American people and Constitution. You're voting for this foreign prince, this foreign potentate, John the 23rd, and he will be the secret ruler of America. And that's 1960, not 1860 with the Know Nothing Party. This is 1960. And so I think that prejudice that was there against Catholics can sometimes help, for American Catholics who've had that history, say, oh yeah, this is exactly like what happened. People are people. And so of course you're going to have people who are hateful and violent, people who are peaceful and loving. There's no greater percentage of Muslims who are hateful than there are Christians.
Can you talk a little bit for our audience how, and if LMU fosters a community that sees beyond politicization of faith and the cycles of violence?
So I think the main way that LMU does exactly what you say, Jose, is because of its founding religious orders. So whether we talk about the Jesuits, whether we talk about the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, whether we talk about the Sisters of St. Joseph, the Congregation of St. Joseph of Orange, all three of those orders have that kind of dialogue. So you look at, for example, the two that give it the name, Loyola Marymount, the Religious Sacred Heart of Mary. What does Father Gaillac do but go out there to work with women in France, where he's from? And this idea that, can we make God known to all people, not just for Catholics, but to people. You look at the Jesuit part, the Loyola part of Loyola Marymount, this marvelous statement that the Jesuits put out about the war. The kinds of things that Pope Francis, for example, right from the beginning, Pope Francis has been calling for a ceasefire. Pope Francis has been calling for these kinds of things. So, if you're a Catholic and understand Pope Francis, if you're a Jesuit who has that obedience to, the Pope, and you're saying exactly those kinds of things, pay attention to that. And I think that's really powerful. And that given that these orders are orders in the world, the Jesuits are a worldwide order. Of course, they began in Spain, but they didn't stay in Spain. So much of the great sort of expansion came from the Jesuits, going to India, going to China, sometimes being received very well, sometimes not being received. So going to Japan, you go around the world and precisely you have those connections, you understand the interconnections around the world. Because in the pre-modern world, it may well have been, this village is Catholic and there's no Muslims anywhere near there. That's changed completely. Whether you're in Spain, whether you're in France, whether you're in America, Islam is the second largest religion in France. That wasn't the case when the Marymount Sisters first started. Islam is probably the second largest religion in America. Now, probably ahead of Judaism. How do we understand that? How do we do that? And I think exactly that sense of those connections, because we talk about ecumenism, that the oikos, the inhabited world, ecumenical doesn't just mean within Christians. That's the smaller meaning of it. When we talk about ecumenical movement, can we bring Quakers and Baptists and Methodists and Catholics together? It really means like the whole inhabited world. Because if we believe that God created human beings in God's image, it's not that God created Catholics in God's image and not Jews and Christians and Muslims or Protestants. It's God created people, And so how do those people come together? So I think given A, the specifically Catholic nature of LMU, and B, the more generally religious nature of LMU that says, this is what we're going to do. This is mandated for us in a way that it may not be mandated if we were a public school, and it may in fact be prohibited if we were a public school.
I know that you cannot answer for others, but you can answer for what you're doing in your own classroom. What kind of dialogue has become common in your classroom? And what, in your eyes, is the ideal student respond to the realities that they're living, not only with their own faith, but in relation to the other faith, and establishing this interfaith exchange as a Muslim student?
So the real privilege that I have, and I can speak for myself first, is that I'm in a field and discipline and area where you can actually talk about this. This is part of the subject matter. So I'm teaching comparative theology. So this is very much the subject matter of the course. That's very different, let's say, from a Muslim professor in engineering. We have lots of Muslim engineering professors. We have lots of Muslim students, especially internationals, who come here because we have a great engineering program. You don't really talk about interfaith dialogue and religion in the engineering classes. You talk about your computers, your mechanical, that kind of thing. Same thing in the business school. We have Muslim professors in the business school. Again, most of the time, we're not doing a course on Islamic finance. It's a course in macroeconomics, micro business, this, business, that. And so they don't have the opportunity to talk about those things. So I do want to highlight the fact that we have those professors in those colleges, like, let's say, the College of Business or like the College of Science and Engineering, who are working with their students outside of the curriculum, kinds of things. Then you have people like me, for example, who in the classes are able to talk with the students about these kinds of issues. So I think having that critical mass of faculty to be able to have those conversations, to be able to support those students, whether it's in the formal kind of way, like making a recommendation to go see this person or that person, or the informal, okay, let's talk about this, how you doing, let's go get lunch, let's get a cup of coffee, tell me what's going on, and being able to do that kind of work. And I think for all of us, having that kind of mentor, friend, support is so useful. And because we have so many of those folks at LMU, I think that's a real service to our students.
In Palestine has so deeply resonated with young Americans here in the United States, all over the country, educated people that are going, at college level. And the same response has not been as deeply embedded in its reaction in regards to the war in Ukraine.
I think that's a great question, Jose, and I think there's a couple of things there. One is just the history of American involvement. And so America has been a strong player in the Middle East, not just in Israel, Palestine, but in Iran, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Lebanon. And so you have that kind of history. Secondly, you have that direct support that ever since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, you've had American governments not just publicly support Israel, but financially support Israel to the tune of billions of dollars. And I think for a lot of people, there's that sense of, wait, what's happening here? Where are our tax dollars going? And that kind of question that is also happening with the Ukraine war. Why are we spending American tax dollars outside of this country when there's so many Americans in this country that need help and support? So you have those kinds of things happening. Part of it, I think, is that, students, of course, are much more aware globally than they ever were because of cell phones, because of the internet, because of those kinds of connections. And so seeing those movements, like, for example, in 2020, when you had the murder of George Floyd, when you had the sort of racial reckoning, when you had the protests around racism in America, the real coming to the fore of, say, Black Lives Matter, there were really famous kinds of things that happened, like actually here, both in Los Angeles and in New York, where you had the police sort of tear gassing protesters, and you had people then on Twitter, posting this, and you had Palestinian kids going, "Oh, I know what to do here. You've got tear gas. They use the same kind of tear gas on us. Use milk. Take a scarf, put it in milk. It's much better than water. Put it on your face. That'll help." And it was like, oh, here you are in real time getting advice from Palestinian students. So in a really interesting way, I think that was one of those ways to go back to your question, where you have a direct link between, let's say, Palestinian protesters and American protesters 4 years ago that you didn't have with Russian, Ukrainian ones. And in a funny way, and I'll say this and I'll stop, it actually surprises me that we don't have more of that kind of protest in around the Ukraine war, just simply because when I grew up, the evil empire, to use that term, was Russia, was the Soviet Union, and perhaps it's because under the previous president, there was this sort of, not even rapprochement, there was a sense of Putin's actually a good person. You want to say, yeah, there's some problems here with that. This is not reclaiming traditional Russian territory. This is invading a sovereign nation. And so you have that kind of thing. So I think, with that, it's literally puzzled me, the kind of American, particularly the Republican Party. I don't mean this in a negative way. I'm just meaning in a point of fact way, sort of siding more with Russia than with Ukraine. And it's like, I don't know how we do that, given exactly the history of America and Russia over at least, since the time that I've been alive.
And thank you so much for, your eloquence and your clarity. Just one more thing that just came to mind. After the interest that has happened since the invasion of Palestine, well, the attack of Hamas and then the invasion of Palestine, have you found, because of the response of what has been happening with young people about Palestine, have you found an increased interest in Islamic studies classes from the LMU population?
I think you have that happening. And so it's a lovely moment where, as you have this increased interest about Islam, Muslims, the Middle East from our students, you've got, faculty at LMU who can actually begin to address those kinds of questions.
Thank you, Amir. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. And I produced this episode with Alex Turner, who also served as editor, and we hope this episode creates fertile ground for fresh thinking and healing. The Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination promotes resolution to fragmented realities in uncertain times. Please join us again next time for another installment of Advocate. Thank you. Bye.